Hello, Wisco history students, and welcome to another lesson in the Cold War. And today we're going to be taking a look at the 1970s. And as we consider the 1970s of the Cold War, we're going to be taking a look at what's called a period of détente, a French word which meant relaxation. We're actually going to see that as we're in the 1970s, that there's going to be an easing of Cold War tensions. And if you recall, as we opened up the Cold War, I introduced you to the doomsday clock. And as I introduced you to the doomsday clock, this hypothetical clock to predict possibly World War III and Armageddon and the end of all things based upon a nuclear attack, that in the end we've gone on a roller coaster ride that saw certain events and certain periods of the Cold War that drew us closer to real war, and other events of the Cold War that actually pulled us away from Cold War. We had the arms race of the 1950s, and yet at the same time, we had a Soviet premier by the name of Nikita Khrushchev who talked about peaceful coexistence. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s, and yet also in that same decade, as you just did a little work yesterday, there was the beginning of some treaties and some actual arms negotiation that started to happen between us and the Soviet Union. And as we get into our final two decades of the Cold War, the 1970s and the 1980s, we're going to go on a roller coaster once again. In the 1970s, we're going to see a real easing of tensions. And then as we get to our final decade of the Cold War, which will happen next week, we're going to see that the tensions are going to get hot once again. And eventually that's going to bring about an end to this Cold War, the biggest event in the world since 1945. This political cartoon in many ways represents this friendship, this cooperation that happened between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the 1970s. You have the symbol of the United States being in the form of the bald eagle. You have the bear being often the symbol of Russia. And then I'm not sure what you got on the stroller. There was some sort of offspring that came as a result of those two animals. But what you have here is really more of a spirit of friendship that started to happen. And that friendship and that cooperation actually are going to lead to treaties, and treaties that for really the first time in the Cold War are going to begin to ease some of the concerns and the fears that this might all eventually lead to a nuclear annihilation and World War III. And as we consider the 1970s, we're really going to be looking at three leaders. From the American side of things, we're going to be looking at the Cold War policies of Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter. And on the Soviet side of things, we're going to be looking at a new Soviet premier, Leonid Brezhnev. For all the things that can be said of the communist world, and certainly the weaknesses and eventually the failures of the communist world, one thing can absolutely be said to their credit is that throughout the 20th century and even moving into the 21st century is that the communist world has often been led by very strong and powerful leaders. When it came to Russia and then the Soviet Union, it started with Lenin, then it went to Stalin, then it went to Khrushchev, then eventually Leonid Brezhnev, and we'll eventually see Mikhail Gorbachev. As you consider North Vietnam, it was Ho Chi Minh. For China, it was Mao Zedong. For North Korea, it was the Kim family. For Cuba, it was Castro. You certainly have seen very strong leaders that have led, and that's probably why the Soviet Union and the communist world has lasted much longer than anybody originally thought. So today, guys, we're going to get into these three men and the leadership and the policies that they're going to bring to the Cold War, which brought about a sense of more friendship and cooperation than some of the tension that existed previous to that. So let's take a look at Nixon's Cold War policy. When it came to Richard Nixon, certainly he's known for the Watergate scandal, and he's known for eventually having to resign from office, and that's certainly kind of the highlight to and what's often remembered in regards to the Nixon administration. But if it wasn't for Watergate, Richard Nixon may go down as one of the more successful presidents of the 20th century. And one of the successes that he had to do with his Nixon doctrine of 1969, and it had to do with an Asian policy. We had previously talked about the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine. I'm not sure if every president has had a doctrine, but Richard Nixon did have a doctrine that said that as we moved into the 1970s, it was time for the United States to have a lesser role in Asian affairs. Certainly, for as much as the Cold War was a world war, and that it was fought throughout places in Europe and the Middle East and Latin America, and certainly also it was really a real hotspot when it came to Southeast Asia. That eventually got us involved with the Korean conflict, the so-called Forgotten War. Eventually got us into the Vietnam War, the longest and most difficult war in American history. And certainly, when you consider the domino effect and the rebuilding of Japan, that there was a lot of communist concern that we had in that part of the world. And Richard Nixon said it was time for the United States to begin to lessen its role in that part of the world that hadn't necessarily seen a whole lot of success for America. In that realm, he is going to become the first sitting president to visit China. Now, we haven't talked a whole lot about a communist China in the Cold War because keep in mind, guys, that this was at the time in which Mao was having to rebuild his country and is having to continue to lead the communist revolution. And we talked about things like the Great Leap Forward and some 30 to 40 million people that starved to death, and the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s that created a lot of havoc within China. And so certainly China was not the communist giant that it has become today, but nonetheless, there was going to be kind of a change in a policy and a change in a positions that's going to happen between the United States and China with Nixon's visit in 1969. He is going to go on what became known as a journey for peace. So this wasn't a conference to be had, negotiations to be settled upon, but just simply an American president visiting the communist world. And as you visit, somebody, you're visiting out of a sense of friendship, as a sense of cooperation, and to a certain extent, that's what Nixon was signaling to both the United States, the communist world, and to the bigger world, that maybe it was time for us to begin to take kind of a different position to the communist world itself. This opened up communist China. Certainly, it's going to lead to then just a greater sense of openness, trade, business. This eventually leads to the outsourcing of American jobs. This obviously is seeing some strange developments today in regards to trade restrictions and Trump's tough talk in regards to communist China. And a lot of it can go back to Richard Nixon, a Republican conservative president who had kept a very close eye on the communist world, that now started to open up communist China and create a little bit more a sense of cooperation between us and them. In addition to that, what came from this visit and from Nixon's administration was what was called Detente. Detente is a French word that means relaxation, and that there really was a sense of relaxation where Nixon announced that Soviet-American relations, that it was now time to move from what had been confrontation that led to things like the arms race and the space race and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the building of the Berlin Wall, to now a little bit more negotiation. And some of that negotiation had already started to happen with things like the Limited Test Ban Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that you had to do a little work on. And we're going to see even greater negotiation that's going to happen next. It's also through this period of détente that Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev are going to visit each other's country. And as we visit the communist world and visit specifically communist Soviet Union, and as they visit us, again, there is going to be, even to some people's minds, maybe even a growing spirit of friendship. And that spirit of peaceful coexistence that Khrushchev had talked about in the 1950s, that once again, people were talking about that again here in the 1970s. Out of that friendship, out of that negotiation is going to come what is probably the most important arms reduction negotiation of the Cold War, and it was called SALT. Specifically, SALT 1, because we're going to see there is going to be a SALT 2. SALT is an acronym that stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, and that's what it was. It was a series of talks that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union, between our representatives and theirs, and it's going to be out of those talks that comes a treaty to begin to limit some of the threats that came through the nuclear arms race of the 50s and 60s. This is 1972, and this is a disarmament treaty. We have the Limited Test Ban Treaty that you read about from 1963. Well, that meant we just simply couldn't test nuclear weapons above the atmosphere, that everything had to be done underground. There was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that you read about, and that meant simply that we couldn't sell or give nuclear weapons to any other country. But we could still continue with our arms race, and the Soviet Union did the same thing. Well, SALT is going to begin to put some limits on those arms races of the past. It is also going to allow for only a missile defense system, and that the idea behind possessing nuclear weapons was going to be for defensive reasons and not for offensive reasons. When it comes to the threats that we see today out of places like North Korea, I mean, Kim Jong Un could possibly, kind of point the finger back at us and say, what gives us the right to tell them that they can't have nuclear weapons when we do have a stockpile of weapons and we've actually used those weapons against, like, Japan? Well, we make the argument that we've only used those weapons and only have stockpiled those weapons for defensive reasons, to preserve peace. And for as much as that's true to somebody like Kim Jong Un, he may not necessarily quite believe that. So the idea behind SALT is for defensive reasons only. Another thing that also came out of SALT is that when it came to the defense that you provide over your country, that you'd only be able to protect your capital and also an ICBM launching site. At this point, they were starting to develop, and here's Washington, D.C., and there is an ICBM launching site. They were starting to develop a nuclear umbrella, a nationwide anti-ballistic missile defense system that NASA and our military were working together to be able to create a kind of a nuclear shield that would eventually be able to protect us against, and they were developing the same thing, protect them against any kind of nuclear attack. Well, that was extremely expensive. It was extremely time consuming, and SALT said, we're not going to be able to develop those, but as long as we agree to it and they agree to it, then there's going to be a great sense of equality to it. And out of SALT, you're going to see for the first time them beginning to really limit missiles and have some serious talks in regards to that. Also, with this, both sides are going to have the ability to absorb a first strike, because if we're going to take out the Soviet Union, you're going to go after Moscow, the capital. If they want to truly take out the United States, they have to take out Washington, D.C. But we now have the means under SALT to be able to protect our nation's capital. And both sides have the ability to retaliate, because one ICBM launching site was still made possible, and ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, which is a missile with a nuclear warhead that can travel 26,000 miles and can basically reach the other side of the world in a matter of about 30 minutes. Well, both sides still have the ability to do a lot of crazy damage to their enemy. With that, nuclear war is now improbable. They actually developed what became known as MAD, mutually assured destruction. They could destroy us, we could destroy them, and since both sides could destroy each other, then in the end, neither side would win. And if neither side can win, then there's no point in playing the game called nuclear war. Then we get to 1979. 1979 was truly a turning point in the Cold War. We've been kind of looking at the big decades of the Cold War, from the 40s now to eventually the 1980s, and there's been those certain years that have played a pivotal role. 1948, 49, both of those years were pivotal in regards to the Berlin airlift, and eventually to the Soviet Union developing the nuclear bomb. 1963 was a pivotal year in regards to especially the things happening in Cuba. 1979 was also very much a turning point in the Cold War. Let me go through a few reasons why. So what they do, after over 2 decades of not really moving on much of the world, and especially the world in and around Eastern Europe, the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And they invaded Afghanistan after a period of not making a military invasion since the 1950s. And as long as the Soviet Union was not on the move and expanding its empire, then to a certain extent, the containment policy of President Truman that then was continued with Eisenhower and Kennedy after him seemed to be working. But then the Soviet Union caught the world by surprise and caught Afghanistan by surprise. Afghanistan is on the border, kind of on the southern border of Russia, and the Russians invaded because there was a new communist regime that was looking to take power there. And as a new communist regime was looking to get some power in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to expand its empire and move their troops down into that region. And eventually are going to provide some support to that communist regime. This eventually is going to become the basis for what is called the Afghan War. An Afghan war for the Soviet Union that went from 1979 to 1988. And it was a war for the Soviet Union that in the end they struggled with. And in many ways, some of the same reasons why we struggled in Vietnam. They underestimated Afghanistan. This eventually led to the rise of the Taliban government. They just struggle in terms of the military side. They didn't necessarily understand the resolve of the Afghan people. It drained the economy, and it also started to show that the Soviet Union really wasn't militarily equal to the United States, that they were what is called a paper tiger. They looked ferocious, but the reality was is that they were very weak both militarily and economically from within. But this stunned America, and it angered America, and it had especially our policymakers going all the way to the White House troubled and angry at what the Soviet Union had just done, especially based upon the spirit of cooperation and relaxation and deals and treaties that were being signed. And once again, it had America saying, you just cannot trust the communist world. Jimmy Carter tried to lay down the law, both economic and political sanctions. But as we talked about Jimmy Carter before, nice guy, probably the right guy to negotiate peace in the Middle East, but he just simply wasn't a strong type of individual or personality to really kind of convince the Soviet Union or the world that America meant business. Then Jimmy Carter did something that really angered the country from within. We boycotted the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games used to be this kind of the showcase of athletic power. And for as much as you have the arms race to show military power, you have the space race to show scientific power. Every 4 years, there are the Olympic Games. And for the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, they were able to bring out their best. Not their best weapons, not their best scientists, but to bring out their best athletes. And, well, Russia was to host the Olympic Games in 1980, and America said, we're not coming. And that left the Olympic Games very empty. It also left many American Olympic athletes very angry. Because if you're an Olympic athlete, you really only get one chance, one time, to be able to showcase the work and the excellence that you have in sport. This isn't like traditional sports, baseball, basketball, football, where you can have a sense of longevity and be able to go after big things for a period of 5, 10, even sometimes 15 years. And so a lot of those Olympic athletes were very angry that they eventually could not participate in the games. And also, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan very much ended the period of détente. Then we get to one more question. One more question that has to do with our final event of the 1970s Cold War. And that question is, do we really have control? And it has to center in on what you see here. This is a nuclear power plant called 3 Mile Island. And it was a nuclear power plant of which there's one of many across the nation to develop nuclear power that is going to have a temporary malfunction that eventually seems like this could eventually lead to a nuclear disaster. And it has, again, those that are against the Cold War and against nuclear weapons, once again saying we have no idea what we're doing with this kind of energy and that this has all been just one big mistake. So let's get to that final. 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island was a Pennsylvania power plant that had a temporary malfunction. There were some bells and whistles that went off, some temperature gauges that indicated that there was going to be some disaster. And as a result of this kind of catching the workers by surprise and the scientific leaders by surprise, it eventually is going to lead to an evacuation of 100,000 people in that area. This is around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And when 100,000 people were forced to evacuate from that area, this not just only made local news, this made national news. National news that then once again created new public fears. Guys, let's go back to the beginning. It was Thomas Edison who had told Franklin Delano Roosevelt that we had the capability of creating weapons of mass destruction in the form of nuclear energy that would just change the course of history. That eventually led to the Manhattan Project. But it was also Edison who said we shouldn't do it because creating this kind of power, this kind of weapon, and we would never really be able to truly control it, and there could be some problems, and there could eventually be some mistakes and human blunder and a variety of things like that that could eventually lead to the destruction of major parts of the world. And with 3 Mile Island, it had people once again wondering what were we doing with this. Um, it was just a temporary malfunction, no serious damage to the area, and they eventually shut down the plant. They eventually did medical tests on the people of that area, and there was nothing that in the end had any long-term damage. But nonetheless, it did lead to again these fears and America wondering what's going on. As we get to the final decade of the Cold War, some of you will know that there was a nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union in a place called Chernobyl that did have not just a temporary malfunction, but had a serious malfunction that eventually led to tens of thousands dying, or not dying, but being affected by it, and eventually the shutdown and the ghost town of a city. So there we have it. We went through quickly the 1970s. It's not one of the more exciting decades, but it was a period of friendship, a period of relaxation, a period of détente. But it's also going to be a decade that Ronald Reagan, when he becomes president, is going to say that was one big waste of time. We should not be friends with the communist world. We should not trust the communist world, and that the only thing that we can do with communism is destroy it. And that's what Reagan's going to do when he comes to power and becomes the president. He's also going to see that the Soviet Union is going to get a new president by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, who also begins to understand that communism has its weaknesses and that maybe it's time to reform that system. And those two men collectively are eventually going to bring about an end to this crazy war called the Cold War. We'll get to that next week. God's blessings to you and have a great weekend.